Hello, and thanks for joining us today. I'm joined by my guest, Anthony Sutton from Cream HR. How are you doing, Anthony?
I'm doing very well indeed. Thanks, David. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. We were discussing off camera there that the last time you and I spoke, we were in a slightly different place in the market, certainly vis-a-vis estate agents and the sort of property market that they've got at the moment. And the tone of the discussions are changing within the industry because as business owners and perhaps managers of people, we have a couple of different things to try and balance. On the one hand, we've got to sort of have some difficult discussions with people because the climate's changed, the attitude needs to change, and what got us through the last 2 years of boom is not going to get us through the next 2 years of challenges. And you add to that the fact that you also want to motivate people, and that's something that taking with one hand and giving with the other. You sometimes forget how to balance it properly. So it's a nuanced discussion, and a
Hmm.
lot of business owners simply don't know where to start. So we turn to the man with the plan, Anthony.
It has changed dramatically since you and I last spoke, and as you know, I've also moved house during that time, so I've been through the experiences and the joys of the UK conveyancing process as well. Um, it's always about people, and it always will be. Our business and all businesses rely on people, and particularly in a sector such as estate agents, where it's massively about the relationships that your teams build with the clients and helping that very emotional sale process go through. It's very important to make sure that we keep the focus in the right place. I think what's hard for many business owners is the fact that um, a lot of people won't have been through this type of experience before. So, a lot of current managers and even owners of estate agents may have experienced some of the 2008 recession and may have gone through the experience of the banking crisis at that time, but in a different role. Of course, there will be a number of people running estate agents who've been through that as owners as well. But the lack of experience of going through tough times, as you say, the market's been very buoyant for a long time, and people are used to a buoyant market. So it's important to keep focus in the right way at the moment. And it's it's quite easy for people to panic in situations like this and to almost freeze with fear at the prospect that things are going to suddenly become very, very difficult. And whilst a reaction is understandable and perfectly normal, and there's nothing wrong with that, it's how you deal with any shock to the system. The important part is to then gather yourself and gather your thoughts and think as clearly as you can about what to do and how to address the challenges. So, as you said, motivating people and motivating a team at this time is very, very challenging when you, as the owner or the manager of a team, are potentially distracted by other things going on behind you that you might be aware of, with everyone looking at costs. So we've got the energy cost spike as well as the challenges of a flattening marketplace. You're sort of seeing those two lines on a graph converging. And of course, at the same time, you've got a team of people that you want to keep very positive and very energized to achieve the best they can from that situation. So I think I always try and treat life very, very simply because people overcomplicate it for effect rather than value. This is really about realizing that people react and need to be managed differently at the moment. So you
And
will have.
I
Sorry,
think
go
it's
on.
okay to acknowledge as well that there is uncertainty. So you might not have the answers. I might not have the answers as to where we're going to. And as business owners, that gives us a certain amount of anxiety. But with team members as well, it's going to cause them anxiety as to whether or not there is a long-term future for them. Job security is something that is now going to become a discussion. You have to be careful how you frame all your conversations with your staff, because at some point you might need to have a difficult conversation with somebody, and in which case you need to keep the tone and the content on track, but also don't wrong foot yourself legally along the way. there are some real pitfalls, aren't there?
There are lots. I think going back to your point about it is normal to react, but as the leader, be very aware of the fact that your behaviors will be picked up on by all of your teams. So there's nothing wrong. Honesty is really important. I think being honest with people is the fundamental baseline that we should all have. Unfortunately, in the world we live in, it tends not to be the norm nowadays. But as a business, we can behave honestly and run honestly and treat people as adults and as human beings on that basis. So I think being aware that we do impact and have a big impact on the attitudes, motivation, feelings of our team is a really important thing to recognize. And of course, there will be potentially some tough decisions ahead for all businesses. I've been speaking to a couple over the last few days who've already made some restructure and redundancies. I was talking to someone this morning who had someone in their team who's pregnant, and they were worried about whether their role could be made redundant whilst they're away on maternity. So you start to get all of these anxieties feeding in through all sorts of routes at the moment. So I think as managers and leaders, I think being conscious of the fact that we have a big part to play in how we do influence the feelings and the sort of general motivation and attitude of the people around us is really important. So trying to keep focused on the fact that there's still huge amounts of business to be had. You know, there's no question that the market's become more difficult, but this is when you really start to use the opportunities to fine-tune skills. So I'll come back to the risk bit around if we are making redundancies and restructuring, because you're right, there are risks around that. I think the starting point is going back to that's my simple analogy, sports team. So you know, a good manager in a sports team or a good coach knows that each player needs treating differently. You know, some people really do respond well to pressure and being put under the cosh and being given absolute, you know, brutally hard challenges to achieve. Very few in my experience. I think most people might say they enjoy that, but in general, that's a rare breed. Most people like to be supported and have someone who's perhaps a bit more arm around the shoulder or a bit more nurturing towards them in terms of how they're going to deal with specific challenges ahead. There are still huge opportunities, and this is a great opportunity, in my opinion, for owners and leaders and managers to really help their teams learn how to do a job well and to really develop the skills needed to do, you know, what they're required to do in a tough time. I think you learn more in adversity sometimes than you do in boom times. If there's that whole thing of if it was easy, everyone would be doing it. When it gets tough, that's the time when people really need to understand that the opportunities they face need to be maximized.
Yeah, there are certainly real opportunities in a different market. And I think particularly what you said earlier, probably for a lot of agents rings true, that if you've got the experience and you've been there and you know how to prosper, if you like, in a market that is tougher. And sometimes it's only hard work that will get you through. But then you've also got a generation of people who, for better or for worse, have only known sort of a very buoyant consumer market that is driven by, I click it, I buy it, it's delivered today, I get it tomorrow. You know, it's we live in that sort of society, and you know, if you were to turn around to that generation, if I were to have that conversation with my kids and say, look, you know, markets go like this, and there will be times where you'll have to start from the bottom again and push upwards and really sort of, you know, a lot of people don't get that, but there is opportunity there because you will simply be working whilst others will be almost like caught in the headlights.
And I think that's the crux to taking this as an opportunity. That comes into that motivation, is helping people to realize it is an opportunity to learn how to upskill yourself to really become brilliant at what you do, because the sector we work in is very much about relationships, as we said earlier. So that's fundamental trust. If I simply go back to my recent experience of buying and selling houses, so I've sold using the same estate agents because I've been in one area for a long time on numerous occasions. He's someone I consider a friend. I trust him. He's a very, very good estate agent, and his ability to behave like that has enabled him to sell a number of and all of my last few houses. So we always default to him as someone to go to. Similarly, on the purchasing side, the guy who was the estate agent for our purchase was fantastic, and his attitude, his positivity, his availability, and his honesty was really important to us in helping us make that move. I gave him a really good rap on his Google ratings review site straight away because he made a difference. So the crux and the message there for me is those are the fundamentals that are really what go into being a successful estate agent. Obviously, knowing your business, knowing your markets, and knowing what's happening in your area. It's all about learning to build those relationships well. I think whenever you're in a sales business, people buy from people. That was an acronym and a message I was given many, many years ago. It's not an acronym. I don't know what I'm talking about, but it was a message I was given many, many years ago. And it's absolutely true. We buy from people we like. We're in the midst of buying some services at the moment, and we've got down to the last two on a few things, and we're actually dealing with the people we like best. So the fundamental thing is when you're in such an emotional buy and sell situation as moving house, for most people, I know there are people who obviously buy for investment purposes and for profits, so they're not tied into the investments, to the emotional side of living in a house, but most people buy houses to live in. It's about the relationship you build as an estate agent with those clients that's really going to help you. So it comes down to what questions you ask and showing a real interest in people. I find a lot of people sort of work in a very transactional way, and that's just doesn't work. As you say, in a consumer booming environment, you can get away with it because people are just moving at 100 miles an hour all the time and they want to get deals done quickly. Whereas actually the skill in the role is to really put the client or the customer center stage of that conversation, so that person thinks you are absolutely interested in them. I was talking to a few guys in some software businesses we work with, so nothing to do with this at all. And the challenges they have are so different from ours. Theirs was, we have so many leads coming into the business, but they're wasting them. And it was almost like, oh, wow, what a challenge that would be to have too many leads. It's, you can never have too many leads, but to me, it means they're not doing their job well if they're not converting at a very high percentage. And that conversion rate is based on building those initial relationships and showing someone that you are trustworthy and that you're someone that will be there to do the job. So in the market that we're in as estate agents, we need to really show those clients that we're interested in them. I go back to my friend who sold my last. I haven't sold a house for a number of years, and the first thing is he remembered all the names of my children straight away. How's X? How's Y? How are they? What are they up to? God, they must be that. Whether it's a skill or whether he's doing that for me is irrelevant from my point of view. He was absolutely showing me that he knew all about me, remembered me, he was interested, he knew what we were up to, and that center stage is important.
We all want that relationship. We all, these days that you'd say VIP, but yes, we all want that VIP service, don't you? Where you are important, but important enough that he will remember the names of your kids, where you move from. And for some people it is a skill, and for some people it's just simple memory. But if you can deploy it properly and if you can remain sincere, I think that nothing builds trust like familiarity. And that's what draws us to friends. That's what draws us to trusted advisors. And you used a very interesting phrase there. You described him as a friend, and you said you count him amongst your friends, and that's fantastic if you can get to that level where you've made that connection with a client.
It is, and think about the flip side of not doing that, because as a country we are absolutely full on giving, if someone's done something wrong, we will make sure everybody knows about that. So is it a 7-to-1 sort of ratio? You might tell one person about some good experiences, but you'll make sure that a lot of other people know about the bad. So if you don't work in the same space, or if someone's so much better than you, that bad reputation is also something to be very aware of at the moment in terms of making sure you don't get one. We use platforms all the time. So the first thing people will do is look at review sites and look at how well someone scores and what their reputation's like. And your role is to enhance that and try and make sure if you've got a challenge. I'll give you a perfect example of that today. I had a great call from my bank yesterday, and then had a terrible call from someone else in there today. And which experience is resonating with me at the moment? It's fascinating. I've given them good feedback on the good one, but I've absolutely given them both barrels on the other one.
Yeah.
Because they were chalk and cheese. So as people, we like to make sure people know when we're dissatisfied. So that skill of building almost friendships or to become friends with people over time is a real attribute. And that's about, it's always based on trust. It's being prepared to go that extra mile. If someone, if you've promised to give someone a call at 5:30, there's nothing worse than having no information, even if there's nothing to report. If I've said I'm going to phone someone at 5:30, then phone them at 5:30 just to make sure you've done that bit, because that builds the trust. I'm having some fun and games with another sector at the moment personally, which is I couldn't, and everybody says they just don't talk to you. They don't keep you in the loop for anything. And because they're in a market where they're in some demand at the moment, they feel they've got the upper hand and they can treat everyone with impunity. Well, they can, but when it gets tough,
we have a memory of these things, and it works that other way, doesn't it? That if you are able to sort of, if you do consider the person a friend, or you've got to that stage in your mind where they're as familiar as a friend, then you will hesitate, and inevitably life can go wrong, and service can go wrong, and things can go wrong. But you'd hesitate before leaving them a bad review, because you would think, well, hang on, Anthony's actually you know what, he's a friend. Things go wrong. These are, we can be a little bit more forgiving. So it sort of stands you in good stead for when life perhaps doesn't go the way we want it to.
It really does. And then I think, coming back to the team and how they're feeling, there will be a lot of anxiety amongst members of staff around bills. We've all been reading and seeing about how people are struggling with the cost of living, with the rise of food banks and the use amongst huge percentage of people who are in jobs. This is not simply people who are struggling to find work. This is a large swathe of the population now who are finding this very difficult. And I think being in a position as the owner and manager, it's important to be there and to listen and to show that you do care about your teams and about whether you're able to do something about it or not at the moment. I think the fact that you're there to try and help and to try and provide support to people, to even if it's just listening to them at the moment about some of the hardships or being able to introduce them to ideas and suggestions, that's the other side of this. There will be people who are definitely starting to struggle financially, as we've been blessed with a very mild winter so far. It might well get colder, and of course at that stage, if people are literally facing a choice between having the heating on or eating, that's a pretty horrible choice for the sixth largest economy in the world. But that's the stark reality of what we're facing at the moment. So I didn't mean to turn it into a negative, but it's just, again,
staying with the negatives for a second, because look, I think we can sit here and ignore the reality, and I think that would be foolish, really, because I think a lot of business owners are going to need to have, in some cases, they're going to have some chats about restructuring. There may be redundancies. There might be difficult conversations to have. And one of the things that we would all want to hope that we could do in doing so is handle it humanely, in a way that there is some compassion. But at the same time, desperate times lead to people acting in different ways. And one of the ways in which people act will be that they become more litigious. There are more claims arising at a time where the marketplace is like that. Yeah.
I think that's absolutely what happens. So in tough times, people will seek to find money from anywhere because that's what they need. That's human nature. You will go and do what you need to. And as a business owner, you're a target in that regard because you are insured, or you're viewed as probably having, I think everyone thinks anyone who runs a business is a very wealthy person, which is obviously far from the truth. But you will be potentially a target. And of course, there's two bits that I love what you said about humanely. That's the most important part of anything to do with this, which again comes down to trust and being honest with people. Redundancy, if there is the requirement to make any redundancies, is a legally acceptable or allowable form of terminating someone's employment, but only if you followed the correct procedures. So if you haven't followed the correct procedures, then of course you still are at risk from litigation, which can be very distracting, very time consuming, very costly, and obviously very damaging. So yeah, I think there's people under pressure will react sometimes in the wrong way. So again, in that whole frenzied environment of a sales team where you're looking at numbers, and if something doesn't happen or if someone makes a mistake, you've got the emotion from the managers who will react to that because they're being measured target wise as well, of going to their boss and saying, actually, we didn't hit those numbers. And you can see how that sort of stress transfers up and down the line very easily, which can lead to questionable decisions. And it's a bit like anything when we all react in the heat of the moment to situations, whether that's something that's happened to us, whether it's sporting events. Again, good example. You react very quickly to highs and lows of what's going on in front of you. I think as business owners, business leaders, managers, it's good not to react. And I think a lesson is to always, before you're going to do something, count to 10 or even park it and think about dealing with it in the morning rather than that evening. I was talking to someone the other day about an email they'd sent, and I said, it's interesting. I said, I'm quite old now, so I've been doing this a long time, and I probably would have done something like that in my younger days, but I learned to draft emails without putting anyone in the send boxes. So I didn't have it accidentally being pressed send. And the benefit of that is obviously when I have to then put the names in afterwards, I'm thinking about, do I actually want to send this now? And it's the same mental.
That is a great tip, actually, because how often do we, it's almost easier, and we talked about being humane there, but it's easier to sort of change your attitude to somebody over an email.
Yes.
And there's a lot of nuance that is lost in messaging or emails that you might be able, that intonation you manage to get across when you're talking to somebody. And also how it's perceived by the person receiving that message. Sometimes to receive an email seems formal and cold, whereas you would expect a phone call if it was more personal or face-to-face meeting. So I'm presuming, though, for people that are clients of yours, your phone must be constantly ringing at the moment with people just checking to see if they're doing the right thing or if the next steps they're about to take are those things that they should do.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who are in that situation at the moment. So I think there's a couple of things to consider. So in general terms, most employees don't get their full employment rights until they've had 2 years service. So if you're going to make restructuring decisions, people with less than 2 years service generally have a little less protection in law than longer serving employees, which makes it easier in some ways if you like to make the decision that way. It doesn't mean it's always the right decision, by the way, which we'll come on to, but obviously employees with less than 2 years service who have any potential characteristics which could lead to a discrimination claim, you have to be very aware of, because discrimination legislation is overarching. So that's for any aspect of life, whether it's employment. So you wouldn't treat someone with a potentially protected characteristic in that way. And also there are things you can do wrong in that process still that could get you into some sort of trouble. But tribunal-wise, a normal unfair dismissal doesn't normally follow from employees who've got less than 2 years service. However, it's still about treating people humanely. And I think I would always advise any difficult meeting. So there's a process to follow. Yes, we are getting a lot of calls, and it's a very straightforward process to follow, although for low numbers of redundancies, there's no time limits in law. We would normally, the route is you effectively tell someone or the people who are affected that they are potentially at risk of redundancy, and then we write to them to send them a letter confirming that and to start a redundancy consultation period. We then set that period of time out, which nominally we would give a couple of weeks to at least, and we have at least two formal redundancy consultation meetings in that period, in which they are allowed to be represented by a colleague or a trade union rep, and they get notice of those meetings and they're fully told of what's going on. So this is about, I use a really weird expression, but I think in a redundancy situation, you should be able to sit naked in front of someone and say, I've got nothing to hide. I'm not playing a game. This is not anything I ever wanted to do, but you can look at me and there's nothing to hide here.
And particularly in this climate, I'm not saying that all of them are justified, but the context of the discussions, it would seem natural, and that's why people are worried, and that's why people are
very much so. I think the things to be aware of that are important is redundancy is always, it's go back to what the word's about. Redundancy relates to work. So you are never making a person redundant, you are making a role redundant. And it's a role in a business. So that could be because we've got less business. So we had 100 inquiries coming in a month and now we've got 50. So on that basis, we do not need as many people. And we had 4 people and now we think we can deal with 2. So that is a reasonable explanation as to why the redundancies may be being made. Then you've got the challenges of why you picked those 2 against the other 2. You have to go through a fair process to show that. I mean, each one is case specific.
There's a whole
so I wouldn't want someone to go away from this and go, well, I've just had to do what Anthony said, because each one is very much individually. So why there's a process to follow, and it isn't difficult, but making sure you've done it properly is important. The crux for us is obviously just to make sure that people realise you treat everyone as individuals, and that we do that. This openness. My phone is ringing. Can you hear that, or will you edit it out?
No, I didn't hear that, but we'll edit it out. Now that you've mentioned it.
No. So redundancy is, again, honesty and openness. This is treating people. The number of things you've read in the past about people being sacked by SMS message or the phone, if you're working remotely, is fine, but it's speaking to people. These are people, and that's the crux of it. They're people with bills to pay, children, families, whatever, and not being bothered to treat people as human beings that you care about is the recipe for disaster, because that's when someone will get angry.
It all comes down to those people skills. We normally ask our guests for some sort of statistic. You've given us a sort of a fact which I find fascinating. Great managers can double team productivity. Bad ones cut it in half, and then you've included in brackets at best. But that is so true, though, isn't it? In a time where there are challenges, you have to be careful with your tone, but how you deal with people will very often dictate the outcome, the atmosphere in your office, the motivation amongst those people, and you need to be able to balance honest with a little bit of inspiration.
And it's a really challenging area for sales-driven organizations. So what that statistic is all about is basically really good managers enable people. So they give them freedom to grow. So that thing about, learn how to manage people and how they are all different is really important, as to get the style of how you approach them. Often what happens in any sales-driven organization, and estate agents are very much driven by that sort of mindset and that culture, is that the best sellers often then become the managers. And actually that's can be a recipe for disaster, because to be a great manager, what was happening last week when I was the great seller is when I walk into that meeting or into that sales meeting, it's all about me, because I'm number one, I'm the best, I've shown it, here's my numbers, I've got testimonials coming out of my ears, I've got referrals everywhere, and everyone loves me, and look at my numbers. When I'm then moved into the manager's seat, that next meeting next week should be nothing about me. It's all about the other people in the room. Your job as a manager has transformed from being the top biller with all of the limelight to being the person who needs to understand that it's no longer about them, to get the best out of those people that they're going to coach, mentor, train, and develop to become what they were in the past. Of course, you get the kudos and the credit through the revenues for the organization, which should go up proportionately and all of those things. But it's very hard often for sales performers to transition well into really positive role models as managers, because partly that psychology of it suddenly becomes about other people, and I'm no longer in the limelight getting the glory.
Yeah, it is tough. It is tough. We're built, us salespeople were built one way, and sometimes
Yeah,
it's a challenge to turn that off. And there's that ego, and there's that whole, and agencies thrive on cultivating that kind of personality. And you're right. You know, if you're successful, you get moved up the chain of command till eventually you end up in a sort of management position. And I think it's okay for people to acknowledge that actually sometimes these are not the best people managers in the world. They need to remain in a sales role and let somebody else do the people-y side of things.
it's a bit, great book that Jim Collins wrote, Good to Great, many years ago, and have the right people on the bus in the right seats.
Yes.
That's the really important. There's nothing wrong at all with spending your life as the best salesperson around and just smashing every target under the sun. Fantastic. That doesn't mean you'll become the best manager, and actually accepting that and choosing to make the right decision is the right thing to do. And again, football is a great analogy in sport. There aren't many top players who become top managers. They might become good pundits, they might become good journalists, they might become good at all sorts of other things, but not many of them transition to being really successful managers and really great managers. Whereas there's a lot of fairly average players who make great managers. And it's not, I realize that being an average professional sports person means they're a phenomenally talented sports person, but in the theatre they're playing in, often it's the ones who are sort of in the mid-table, but that's often people who are really good at analysing the game, who understand the mechanics, the motivations, how it all goes and fits together. And it's a bit like Sir Alex Ferguson's one of the obvious ones to always pick on, but he knew who to put an arm round, and he knew who to give the hairdryer treatment to.
Yes.
He didn't treat, and he never let them down in public. That's another thing. So when he was under pressure, when they were performing badly, he'd never make disparaging comments about his team in the press. He'd deal with that in closed doors, and that's another thing that we need to be aware of as managers.
You're right, and I don't know if Sir Alec is going to be the great example of this, but there are some fantastic managers that were average players. Let's face it. Not and those people, they understand the game, they understand the business, they understand the challenges. They also understand the egos in that changing room and what it takes to turn it around. So I think you're right. Sometimes we just need to sort of be disciplined enough within our businesses to know that what makes me a great salesperson might not necessarily make me the best leader in the world, and that's okay. That's all right. Somebody has to do the selling, somebody has to do the leading.
And I think that's fundamental to the decision making around now if people are thinking about restructuring. So if you're owning a business, you're the owner or part of the board, and there's a pressure to make some changes, then one of the biggest things to consider is actually that head v heart decision of making the right decision for the business, because that's making the right decision for everyone. And I use a phrase called holding the mirror up to people. So this is where ego gets in the way. We all have egos, and some are bigger than others. And in a sales environment, we obviously know there's some pretty powerful egos at play. And often it's that sense of, well, I want that because it gives me the title, it gives me the status, it gives me the gravitas, and people will look up to me because I'm in that position. But as the owner, you've got to make the decision of saying, yeah, you might want that, but actually the best place for you is carrying on being the best salesperson, because the business needs you to be performing, and the other guys need to learn from you and watch you and see how you do it. And actually we've got someone else who's going to come in and be really good manager who will maybe do more of the detail work of understanding that, Anthony down there is actually pretty good at doing all this, but he struggles to ask a difficult question. So I'm going to work with him on how to ask those difficult questions. And it's that subtlety sometimes of just small changes that can really make the difference between thriving, because there are lots of businesses that succeed in tough times. That's the other thing. There's loads of the best businesses and the biggest business in the world have been formed and created in tough times. But this is that moment where making the right decision as the business owners is vitally important. And then that's about communicating and making sure that people understand why we're doing what we're doing, and that there's a very open channel there. So if someone was expecting that status and that kudos because they get a title, it's spending time with them to explain the situation and why this is the right thing for everybody, and looking after them. And actually, that's another topic that's very interesting at the moment. Actually, I know you always like to ask me things of value. One of the things that's go back to the cost of living crisis and the fact that people are at the lower end of the salary scale particularly are struggling. I know obviously if you're earning more and you've got a big mortgage, you'll be paying a lot more through that route as well. But I suppose in general, you look at people in lower paid jobs as having maybe less access to resources if they're struggling. Traditionally and for years and years, most businesses award percentage pay rises to individuals. So you're simply accentuating the gap between rich and poor all the time without intending to, perhaps. But a 5% pay rise to someone on 50,000 is a lot more money than a 5% pay rise to someone on 20. Sure. And we've seen a number of organisations really try to get on board with doing that differently at the moment. So where they're doing pay rises, which are often just cost of living based at the moment, they've run an exercise that basically said, okay, if we were to give a cost of living, so say we were going to give 5-10% pay rise, and because that's all we can afford, instead they'll run a calculation to say across the business this is going to cost us this much money, and instead of awarding that percentage as they used to, they'll just split the amount of money and give it equally to everybody, so everybody gets the same amount of money. But obviously, percentage-wise, that's giving the lower paid people a higher pay rise, which is a really nice way of trying to help some of the poorer paid people in the organisations get a little bit of a lift up.
It's fantastic. I always find it very sort of calming to speak to you and almost reassuring, because you have a great perspective on these things. But I think also you have the benefit of working with a number of different businesses across a number of different disciplines, and you can take the best and the worst out of all of them and sort of use that experience to guide people. In terms of the estate agency businesses that might be watching this and listening to it, is there one particular kind of business that you prefer to deal with, in terms of who would represent a great client for you, or is it more general?
It's pretty general. I mean, we view that all businesses rely on people. We don't spend a lot of our time with huge organizations. We don't work much in the corporate space, so we're not dealing with many businesses that are sort of 500 plus, but are generally organizations that are probably between, I guess, about 20 and 100 employees, where they possibly don't have much access to the sort of expertise that we can provide because they haven't got that internal structure. They may have some HR, but it's generally going to be pretty stretched just doing day-to-day management and organizational stuff. So that size of organization where they care about people. The one thing that matters to us is actually working with people as we go. We mentioned at the start that we like, that we trust, that we know we can work with. We don't work very well with people who are just hatchet people and who want us to go in and do the dirty work for them. And we have experience of sacking clients who we realised after a fairly short space of time they just wanted us to try and purge some people they didn't like, if you like. Yeah. We like to work with people who actually care about this, because that matters.
Yeah, no, it's a refreshing perspective, and I would highly encourage anybody to have a conversation with you, because I feel like I walk away from each one a little bit wiser. But I would love to have somebody like you at the end of the phone. If I had to make difficult decisions, I wouldn't be doing it on my own. I understand where my limitations are, and I think sometimes people should as well, in general. So thank you very much, Anthony, for your time. It's really been enlightening.
It's an absolute pleasure, David. Thanks for your very kind words. And we are literally on the end of the phone if anyone does need to talk to us.
Fantastic. Thank you.